Hello again everyone, Will, Vincent and Paul Jenkins here for the third part of our look at the 2013 iRacing.com Indianapolis 500. Now so far we've talked about the teams and the drivers who we think will be making the field of 33, as well as also looking at that mental and physical preparation that the drivers will have to go through in the month of May. And in this episode we're going to be talking more in depth about qualifying, those 4 laps that make up your average time, which then puts you either in the field of 33 in the biggest race of the year for IndyCar drivers in sim racing, or on the outside looking in. And joining me again is Paul Jenkins, as well as a special guest in Randy Crosno, who will be giving you an insight from a driver's point of view in this episode as well. But Paul, 4 laps, it doesn't seem like a lot. However, for Indianapolis, it's not just 4 laps. It is really the toughest test that we have all year long, doing 4 laps at the absolute limit to qualify for the iRacing Indianapolis 500.
Oh, we had alluded to this earlier in the podcasts we were doing before that, you know, this is one of those tracks that's deceptively simple, but really in reality, in order to squeeze the absolute most speed out of it, you have to be very, very precise, which is a tall order considering the speed you're going around this place, and never more so than in qualifying, because I mean, I really do honestly think that the top split on Saturday, we're going to be seeing the entire field covered by less than a second. So you can imagine that, I mean, in reality, you are talking about in the span of 10 miles, you're talking about the distance of maybe 40 or 50 feet that's going to separate you from the front to close to the back of the pack. And I mean, you just have to be flawless. The level of concentration that's involved to keep a car that is just on the razor's edge on a precise line for that long is quite a task. And consider too that the car is going to be changing as you're going along. The tires are going to heat up, the fuel's going to be burning off, so you have to stay on top of the changes that are happening with the car.
And now in 2012, Young-O scored pole position in a time of 39.112 for his 4-lap average. Now, the 33rd driver who started the race, that was Dave Judson, who did a time of 39.280. Now, Ron Bourdon Jr. was just 3/1000ths of a second off of the pole time. But you look at drivers like Will Vincent, that's me. You know, he was just 1/1000th of a second, over 4 laps faster than Dave Judson. 4/1000ths of a second from missing the cuts. And then you had Brad Sanford, Neville Jr., Carlos Blanes Jr., all equal on times. That battle for that 33rd spot always is one of the most nerve-wracking experiences that any sim racer ever experiences.
Well, and to think that it can all go wrong just in the blink of an eye. I mean, literally. And not so much hitting the wall, but just if you miss a spot, if you have to lift, if the back end steps out just a little bit, it's the difference between being in the race and being on the sidelines. And you know, at least with the iRacing Indy 500, you are offered multiple chances to make the field. So you know, at least if you make a mistake and you have enough time to correct it, you can go out and try again. Now, traditionally, and I think back to events like the ISOWC or the events like that, where we have the traditional pole the pole day qualifying and then the bump day qualifying. You know, you get to a point where you don't have a lot of opportunities to get it right, so even more pressure on you. But we had talked about this before too, and we'll talk about this a little further down the program about when you're going to make your attempt.
And at the top of the field as well, we talked about this before already as well, that it's a waiting game in many ways. Now last year, Mitch McCracken set his time very early on. Brady Cherry also set his time very early on, as did Sean Stroud. People like Chris Cahill, Marty Sponder, Jeremy Paul, they set their time early. Young-O comes literally at the very last moment and gets pole. And that really, and John Paquin did that, and Young-O did that in 2011. They threw that spanner in the works late, knowing that it's very easy, perhaps, to find 5/100ths with a week to go. With 6 hours to go, it's almost an impossible task to do.
And that's really Young's MO, is to hold his cards very close to his chest until the last moment and then go out and put the time down to beat with no time to beat it. So it's definitely a consideration of, depending on what kind of speed you have in the car, when are you going to put those times in? And I think we'll see people that are fast but might have a little more work to do put a time down, basically run out the flagpole, see what happens, and get an idea where they stand early on so that they have time to make the adjustments. But the really, really fast guys, the Youngos, the Tim Doyles, the John Paquins, they're going to be waiting till the last moment, and I think you're going to see the pole time's going to be popped up in the last maybe 2 or 3 hours worth of qualifying before the race. And they just want to put it up as late as possible, give people as little of an opportunity as possible to get out and try and beat it.
And how much is qualifying like in not only IndyCar on iRacing, but iRacing's longest game of poker?
It really is. And it's always said that, and it's such a unique thing about Indianapolis in particular, and is that the qualifying is its own race, and it really is. I honestly think that the qualifying is more fun than the actual race itself, just to watch the strategy being employed. And of course, you'll be at the actual race this year. So you look at what's going on the track, but you look at what's also going on in the pits and what's being brokered and setup strategy and all that. And we're going to get a lot of that here too. You're going to have alliances made that may or may not have anything to do with teams. So when you're in the weeds and you're looking for help, sometimes you can find that extra speed just by being counseled by the more senior drivers. It may be something you've overlooked that might be obvious. It might be something that they know that you don't about driving the line. So you're going to see a lot of this too, where there's going to be a lot of negotiation, a lot of things going on off the track that will impact what happens on the track.
And I think as well, those last 4 or 5 hours, you're not just looking at pole position, you're also looking in that battle for the 33rd position as well. And I don't really ever talk about myself, but I remember last year my internet connection died with 6 hours left to go, and I was on a mobile phone looking at the time, seeing myself falling further and further back. I mean, I was less than 1/100th of a second from being locked into the field, and I had to wait until race day to figure out whether or not I'd actually made it. And that was the same for Dave Judson, for example, the last guy to qualify. But then you have people like Rob Bourdon Jr., Al Nagy, Sam Bonzett, Michael Chin, Joe Branch, Mark Shute. They were very close to getting in the field. They were less than 2/100ths of a second, over 10 miles from getting into the field last year, showing just how close it is. And I talked about pressure last time around. Those last 3 or 4 hours, if you're in 30th through to about 35th, it is all about pressure. Going out on that last run and just finding a way under everything else, knowing that other people are also trying to go faster. Nail those lines every single lap. All the way, and we'll talk about this in a moment, all the way from the second you exit pit road to the time that you come past that yard of bricks on the 5th time, giving yourself your 4-lap average. It is so difficult to do. And Paul, for those guys, anywhere, I say 30th through to 35th, I'm probably more implying anywhere from about 20th through to about 35th. It's a waiting game. And I tell you what, I think for those people, iRacing traffic from IndyCar just shoots up those last 4 hours.
Well, I've always contended that the most exciting portion of qualifying isn't pole day, it's bump day. And, these guys are all just struggling to find it. And these are the guys that are pushing the car at or beyond the edge, pushing themselves at or beyond the edge just to make the show. And it tells you how important it is to just make it. You look at the starting grid of Indianapolis 500, and really the front of the front of the grid always gets a lot of the attention, but the guys that are in the back rows, these are the people that they really are living the dream. I mean, you think about it, oh man, you're in 33rd position in the biggest race in the world. You're dead last, but hey, dude, you're in the show.
Indeed, and I talked to Dave Judson about an hour before the race last year. Him and I, we shared pretty much the last two positions on the grid, and the nerves was just astronomical. And also Monica Claire Brand as well. I talked to her. She qualified in 27th, so in theory she was safe in the field. But still, she was only 3/100ths of a second from being bumped out of the field. And she told me after qualifying, she was shaking like there was no tomorrow. She had no idea coming into that final qualifying session if people were going to go faster. And for her, she said, unlike in 2011 when she knew that she was guaranteed to be in the top 15, 2012 she was on a knife edge. And that impacted not only her performance in qualifying, but in the race as well. And don't forget, Monica then ended up running in the third position for much of the race until a late race caution put the field back together, and then she ended up falling out of contention due to an incident with Brad Sanford in the last couple of laps of the race. But let's talk about the actual qualifying run itself, Paul. And everyone always thinks about the fact that you start thinking about it in turn number 1 on your first lap. That's completely wrong. You start thinking about that run the second that you let go of that pit limiter and you go over that bump on the exit pit road, on that access road, and you start your run. That is when you've got to be on it.
That's a unique feature of qualifying for this particular event. Is unlike the traditional Indianapolis qualifying run where you have your pit exit and then you have a warm-up lap and the green flag falls in your second time around. Not so here. The green flag flies on your first time past that line. So quite literally, your qualifying can be won or lost in the first 100 yards of the qualifying run when you're going below 150 miles an hour. It's all about how you get out of the pits. And you had mentioned it before, that nasty, nasty bump right before you get onto the warm-up lane right out of the pits. There's a fine line by about how fast and how hard you can hit that and maintain your momentum without spinning the car. So just one of those weird track anomalies where, you've got 10 miles worth of flat out 230 mile an hour racing to get around this track, but it can all be won or lost just trying to get out of the pits.
And after you get over that bump, you've got to swing that car pretty much onto the racetrack and then dive back down for the second part of the access road. You can't just come onto the racetrack. And that second part of the access road is so important. I always used to set myself a target speed of 217 miles an hour that I had to hit as I went from tarmac, and you can see the grass appear on the left hand side, signifying the end of the access point. And that second part, the way you've got to dive it in, the car's on cold tyres, it doesn't want to turn because it's on the flat. Yet you still got to hope and pray that it will kind of get through there without spinning the car around. And my attention will turn to John Paquin in qualifying for the 2012 ISOWC Indianapolis 500 on his pole position shootout lap, when he was the fastest guy by a country mile in pole day itself. Comes to that last 9 shootout, he put the 2 right hand side tyres on that grass, spun it around, game over. And that second part of the access road really is important.
I remember that one well. John Paquin was the odds-on favorite to just take the pole in a spectacular fashion, and just one little lapse of concentration. That was coming, I believe he caught the grass coming out of the pits again. So on the turn 1 access road before he even got to the point where you swing that car out. So you hit the bump and the car just kind of skittled out just enough. And you got to realize that access road, maybe 15 feet wide, maybe. And it's very narrow. It is wide enough for one car. And you're asking the car to go blasting through there. Now here's a car you've set up to turn on a banking It's set up to go straight in a straight line on flat pavement, but it's you're now asking this car to transition from, and there's just a very faint amount of banking when you come off of that transition onto the flat again. So you're upsetting the car that way. You're at over 200 miles an hour. You're smashing down onto that turn 2 access lane from the short chute. And it's really a matter of just setting a trajectory with the car and hoping that it gets out the other end if you're going to be fast enough to get the pull. But any little mess up at all and you catch any part of that grass, and at best you're going to slow down, but at worst you're going to end up just cementing that car into the outside wall.
And then if you do survive that point, you're onto the racetrack, you're on the back straightaway, you've got your 217 miles an hour target speed, you're chortling it down to turn 3 and 4, and then you've got another situation where you're still on cold tyres, but you've got to get that speed up, and you see the top drivers, they take a different line into 3 and 4 to try and keep that top speed high. However, on cold tyres especially, you've not really got that much to play with, because this track is only really 3 lanes wide at best. And even though we've talked about already turn 3 and 4 arguably easier than turns 1 and 2, you really can't put a foot wrong, because otherwise, you know, you'll get a little bit loose, for example, into turn 3, it runs over. A little bit tight out of turn 4, you're going to be a bit like J.L. Hildebrand, smack into the wall. And all the way through that outlap, there is so much that you've got to think about. And you think about as well, you know, you've still got to set your anti-roll bars, your weight jacker for that first lap as well, whilst you're chortling along at speeds already of over 225 miles an hour.
Yeah, you'd think that you're just buzzing along in a front stretch and you're just waiting for the next turn to come up before you have to be a driver again, but that's anything but the truth here with this car. The top drivers are very, very busy in the cockpit, making adjustments for the next turn, making adjustments for what's gonna come up next. And you know, again, you had mentioned cold tires, and now with the new tire compound that they've come out with, this is even more important because cold tires are more pronounced now than they were maybe before. So on that first lap, the car is going to be very, very different than it was or than it will be for the rest of the run. So you've got to think ahead about, okay, what's going to happen with my car? What do I need to do to stay on top of it? Because the first time you come through there with cold tires, most of the cars are going to be a little bit loose. They're going to turn a little bit better. And you have to be very careful, obviously, in turn 1, not to set the car up so it turns so well that you end up getting loose, because obviously that's going to at least kill speed, if not just kill the car. But you come around for that second lap, you've got an entirely different car than you did that first lap, and you have to be ready for it.
Good point indeed, and I'll tell you what, again, talking to Monica Clara Brown and Niles Anders back in 2011, and they famously ran a different weight jacket and a different anti-roll bar setting for each of the 16 corners that made up their timed run. And it's phenomenal to think about the fine-tuning that goes into these cars, but realistically, Paul, if you're going to want to make a change to your car, you're going to want to have that car looser down into turn number 1, to get that car to turn and keep that momentum high. But it's not as simple as that, because of the fact it's not about getting that car down into the corner, it's about keeping those RPMs high and making sure that you've got the momentum to then get through turn 2 onto the back straightaway.
Absolutely, and you hit on a very important word there, momentum. That is what it is all about here with this. And you've got the car all the way up at 220, 230 miles an hour. 1 mile an hour is all the difference in the world. You have to be able to keep the momentum. And if you having the car being able to swivel around the corner, and it's really the best way I can describe it, is important. But on the other hand, you want the car to keep the front and rear wheels in line with each other. If you've got a car that's sliding around the back end, you're going to lose a lot of energy scraping off of those tires. Not to mention the fact that you're going to start heating those tires up, and the car's going to become cantankerous on you. So it's a fine line of getting around the corner with a car that'll swivel around the corner, but you don't want it to do it so much that you burn off speed with a loose car. You had mentioned too about RPMs. One of the interesting features of the last couple of builds is they've made changes to the drivetrain of the car. The result of which is shifting actually takes more time between gears. Now, of course, these cars have sequential gearbox, automatic shifting. All you have to do is punch the up and down, and the car will change gears. But unlike last year, the car is going to take more time doing that, and when it engages the gear, there's some flexibility in the drivetrain. All of this translates into a slower shift. So where you might have shifted 2 or 3 times in a qualifying run, now you might want to think about not doing that, because every time you shift is going to slow the car down.
And that has an impact as well, especially down into turn number 1, because traditionally it used to be either in 5th or 6th gear coming down into the corner. You used to smack it down 1 or 2 gears, and that would also help the car turn. You put you shift down a gear, the drivetrain engages, and then all of a sudden that car just turns a little bit more to the left, which helps it, especially for that treacherous turn 1. Against, in some occasions, down into turn 2 as well. I did see last year some people running 6th down into turn 1, flicking it down to 5th for turn 1 itself, and then down into 4th to help that car turn down into turn number 2. That doesn't work anymore, so how do you get that car to turn into the first corner?
Well, there's going to be a lot of different strategies. Of course, you consider, too, that this track is so different from one side to the other that it's extremely difficult to just pick one gear where you're going to be able to keep the RPMs up on the back side of the track and not hit the rev limiter on the front side of the track. And we'll talk about how the elevation plays and all of this, how very different the turns are here in a minute. But, it's one of those things where you've got to sit and think about how far up the RPM chain am I going to allow the car? Because if you hit the rev limiter at the wrong time on the front stretch or at all, it's going to slow the car down, because obviously it's letting off the gas. Now, the thing about it is, if you have it set so that you hit the rev limiter just as you're making the turn in, it can actually help you, because what that will do is the car will, you're effectively lifting off the gas without lifting off the gas. It helps to plant the front end and help the car turn in. So there's a lot of different ways of setting the car up. Now, of course, it all depends on, too, is if you make your turn-ins right. If you end up having to smack it down in the 4th gear to get up the backstretch, well, you're going to have to shift up again on the way through there. So that's going to slow you down.
And you talk about the elevation changes, right? You downhill, you're faster down into turn number 1, then turn number 3. And we've talked already about how simpler turn 3 is, and then turn 4 as well. But those 2 corners, I mean, yes, they may be momentum corners, but you alluded to this already as well. You mess up 1 corner on 1 lap, that momentum, it's not gone for that lap, it's gone for 2 laps at the very least. Because you lose, I don't know, a 10th, say, in the first lap, but that momentum, trying to get the speed back, you won't get that extra mile an hour back until you're probably already at that same point on the racetrack the second time around.
Well, exactly. Well, I mean, you lose momentum here. It's going to be a lap before you see it. So not only is your lap that you lost momentum going to be ruined, but the lap after it is going to be affected also, because you're not going to be back at full song. Important to understand, the RPM power band in this car is extraordinarily narrow, pretty much, and we'll bring Randy in here to talk about some of this information too. But the RPM band in this car, effectively, all of the power is centered right around between, I would say, 9,800 RPM and 10,200 RPM, maybe a little bit less than that. But of course, the rev limiter is right around 10.3, maybe a little bit over that. But a very, very narrow power band you have to contend with. You get below that, and you lose significant amounts of power. And you get above that, obviously, you do too, until you hit the rev limiter, you lose all of it.
And before we talk to Randy, to sum up this part of the section, getting those 4 laps, well, I say 4 laps, really it's 4 laps, 3.5 corners complete. How tough is it to actually nail those apexes for... And it's only essentially 19.5 corners. Surely it can't be that hard, they say.
You'd think, but, there's a lot of time to think about what you're doing on those front straights. And you only think you can traverse the front straight in Indianapolis in about, at 8 seconds, maybe less than that. But, in the car, it's an eternity. So you're thinking about all those things. But again, at those speeds, you're talking about turning point and the angle of the wheel and inches and feet. I mean, it's you're traveling more than a football field a second at 230 miles an hour. I mean, just conceptualize the amount of speed and the quickness that you're going to have to think about to nail each of those corners. And just a foot off of the bottom, and your momentum is changed. Your trajectory is changed, and so really the amount of concentration you have to just to be able to maintain the line for each corner and make the adjustments on the fly. There's really so much more to think about than just turn the wheel, hit the corner, blast on.
We'll bring Randy Crosno now into this conversation, and Randy, you have already got yourself into the top split of an Indianapolis 500. You qualified in 2012 pretty well, actually, kind of mid-pack in the first split, qualifying yourself in 15th, starting the race in the 13th position. First of all, you were very close in a battle from all the way through about, I don't know, the top 10 down to about 22nd position. How stressful was it for you?
It was stressful, but I kind of welcomed that stress challenge. It was a lot of fun, but what you guys alluded to earlier is true. You get so many different chances. Now, I'm a mid-pack runner, and so for me, qualifying in the mid-pack was all I was trying to achieve. So, I didn't have to hold the cards holding my chest. I was able to go out there and make a run on a pretty, quite a few runs, and so there was less pressure for me. But those guys that wait till, like John Paquin and everybody that waits till the last minute, that's amazing what they do. Personally, I could never do that. But I was happy. The first part of the qualifying, when it started, I put up a pretty good time. So I was kind of happy with it. But, I kept my eye on it and practiced a few more times and kept qualifying and then nailed one. It's just, it's a lot of fun, though. I like it.
Now, if you were to go 2/100ths of a second faster, you would have ended up in the 7th position. If you were to have gone 2/100ths of a second slower, you would have ended up in about the 24th position. That shows just how close things are. From a driver's perspective, how difficult is it to find 2/100ths of a second, for example, over the course of 10 miles?
It's really tough. It really just comes down to you have to, as you guys said earlier, getting out of pit road, going through the short chute, swinging out wide, coming through the turn 2 access road, getting on the back straight with all the speed, and then you've just got to nail everything from there on. One little slip up and you're going to lose who knows how much. But again, that's what makes the challenge. That's what makes it so fun. And then you compare the iRacing Indy 500 to the 16th Street League and your league, the ISOWC will, and that those are pressure cookers because you've only got so many chances. It's not like you've got a whole week's time to get your time down. So they're all fun in their own rights, though.
Indeed, and bringing Paul back into this conversation, it swings and roundabouts in some way. You talk about ISOWC, you talk about 16th Street, you've got essentially 6 attempts over the course of the weekend to set a time. Yes, however, at the same time, when you've got a week to set a qualifying time, the competition level, with gaps in those drivers, it is so much closer that 2/100ths of a second can equate to 10 places on the grid.
Well, absolutely, and that's really the thing to think about is, even though you have time, do you really have time? It's really one of those things where, and you're talking about people here who have been working on these setups for weeks at this point, and you get out there, you think you've got it, you nail down a time, and then somebody comes out and knocks you out of the field, and suddenly you're right back where you started from. It's as if you didn't do any work at all. Now suddenly you've got to find something you couldn't find before in the span of hours. The stress level is just astronomical.
And Randy, to bring you back into the conversation as well, like myself, you're not just a driver, you're a team manager. And last year, you qualified, as I say, in the 15th position, but you had, teammates, Jeffrey Kohlbergen, Jason Donafee, Jeff Yeager, struggling, who couldn't quite get into the top split. We talked about momentum, but motivation also comes into it as well. And for those guys being on the outside looking in, it took a lot of motivation to keep them going, to try and improve over the course of the week.
Yeah, it did. Just like everything else, there's struggles. We all pretty much had the same setup, but it's that magic line that you hit. It's that the way you turn the wheel, the less input from your steering wheel, the better. And all those things you work on it. I know some guys work on the force feedback settings just as much as tinkering with the actual setup to try and find that extra little bit of speed. So, but again, it's a heck of a week because you have so many chances. And I've found that with my qualifying attempts, when I just go out there and just do it, I'm usually better. But when the harder I try, the slower I go. And so that was some of the things that we talked about as a team. It's like, okay, just relax. You know what? Go a little bit slower. That old saying, you got to slow down to go fast. Well, it's true at Indy qualifying as well, because if you overdrive anything, you're really going to lose the momentum on that lap and the consequent lap afterwards as well.
And Paul, this is probably the only racetrack where the idea of the super teams, you kind of throw that out the window, because even in a big team with, say, 10, 11 drivers, one setup cannot work for everyone. Randy alluded to, for example, tweaks to the setup, tweaks to force feedback settings, power steering, and the way your equipment itself. But still, everyone's got to adapt to Indianapolis. And in some ways, it's a lot easier to adapt a setup to yourself than trying to adapt to a setup.
Well, there's so many variables that have nothing to do directly with the car. You think about the driver, the equipment that they're using to race. Randy and I can work on an absolutely identical setup and have pretty significantly different times. It's just a matter of what works for me versus him, and what equipment I'm using, what setup I have here at home, and so there are so many factors that don't have anything at all to do with the settings inside iRacing, but more of external things. And again, Randy was talking about tweaking things like steering ratios and force feedback and things like that. These are all comfort level things that will help Randy to understand and feel better what the car is doing, and maybe adapt to the equipment that he has in front of him. Whereas I might like something a little, maybe a little less feedback, maybe a little more steering ratio. It's again, you get to a point where you can't really keep banging your head against the actual setup of the car. You've got to start looking within.
And to turn our attention to qualifying itself, and we start talking about drivers. Now, Young O holds the course record for a 4-lap average qualifying. Last year he did a 4-lap average of a 39.112. Now, we really don't expect drivers to be going that fast this time around this year, but when you talk about drivers, people like Young O, people like John Paquin, Brody Kutschgary, also Tim Doyle, Martin Miller, you could even put Ryan Norton and Kerry Bettenhausen into that list, and Chris Cahill as well, all qualifying specialists. Who's going to be the front row for this race?
Oh, you're asking me. I think if Paquin runs, I would look for him to be on or very close to the front row. Obviously, Young O, anytime he straps on a race car at Indianapolis, is pretty much you're going to see him on the front row. Tim Doyle, I like to see what he's got. I think that even if he does not end up on the front row, if he's anywhere close to the front, the way he works strategy, I would look for him in the later stages of the race to be looking towards the front. But again, this is one of those races too where being on the front row is only advantageous into the first corner. Beyond that, a lot of it has to do with just staying in contention and staying out of trouble. So even if you start the race in 20th position, as long as you can maintain that lead lap and stay in contact, you've got a lot of race to work your way up.
So in what that way, are you saying that in the harshest of realities, qualifying is only really important to getting you into the field, because of course, when you put it into perspective of the other Oval World Tour events, normally it's iRacing that's the deciding factor. This is the one chance of the year that someone with a 700-800 iRacing even could, in theory, make the top split. And we have seen in 2 years that the highest strength of field race actually hasn't been the field of 33 that make up the feature race. So is it more of a case of just qualifying to get in and then worry about race, or do you still put all your effort into qualifying first?
Well, I think with how close the field is going to be, you can't discount qualifying at all. There's no such thing as just skating into the field here with such a deep field. So I think that a lot of drivers are not. I mean, myself, I won't be racing Saturday. Obviously, I'll be in the booth with you. But there are a significant number of racers who are going to be looking towards, I just want to get into the field solidly and then concentrate on the race. I don't think there's going to be more than maybe half a dozen to a dozen drivers who are even going to be thinking about pole position. If they get it, great, but chances are it's not going to happen. So just get the car solidly in and just be there on race day, because obviously if you don't start, you can't win it.
And that concludes this section of the GlacierTV ICELounge Indianapolis 500 special, taking an in-depth look at the 2013 Indy 500. Now, don't forget, the broadcast race will be with our friends over at PSR TV on the 25th of May 2013. Start time for that will be 2 p.m. Eastern. And you never know, there might have been a bombshell dropped at some point in this podcast. You'll have to go back and have a listen, try and figure out what it was. In the meanwhile, however, in the fourth and final part of this, we'll be talking about that 500-mile race itself, about the strategy, about the mindset, about what you have to do to work your way through the field or maintain that race lead. So join us for the fourth part of that. In the meanwhile, I've been Vincent, that's been Paul Jenkins, that's been Randy Crossley. Thank you very much to both of you, and we'll talk to you in the next part of this GlacierTV ICELounge special. Bye-bye.